when I do the kind of overview of open access, one of the things that I like to talk about is kind of contrasting it with the kind of traditional publication model, because with the internet, with the availability of preprints and things like that, the publishing landscape of scholarly research has shifted a little bit, and hopefully in some good ways, but also in some ways that can potentially raise problems. Contrast open access publishing with traditional publishing to start off. And then I'll talk a little bit about the stages of publication in terms of manuscripts and revisions and things like that, because under certain publishers' publishing agreements, what you're allowed to deposit in an archive, a repository like SOAR, is limited by the publisher's publishing agreement. So I'll talk a little bit about that, a little bit about how you might want to preserve your own author rights so that you can make things available either through an open access publication or archiving it yourself for people to be able to freely access, but also for you to potentially reuse your work. A lot of people
they wouldn't be able to rip mine off. It's almost, is it almost like a copyright stamp or something? Is
that's a big part of it, certainly. Part of, just to address your question directly at the moment, part of the open access movement is the creation of new licensing structures, new agreements that preserve copyright, but let people know in advance what they're allowed to do with that work. So most scholars aren't, it's not like writing a best-selling novel, right? We're not putting that scholarly paper out there to reap enormous royalties. Most scholars get absolutely nothing and may even pay to get their research published in some circumstances. So when it comes, the currency for a publishing scholar is really, the majority of their interest is in having that work consulted, having that work cited, and building their reputation that way. So traditional copyright kind of locks things down pretty strongly. We can talk about all the protections under copyright, but for these purposes, it boils down to you're not allowed to take my work and distribute it, and certainly not for profit, and you probably shouldn't be altering my work in any way and then reselling it.
Right.
So what a lot of the what we call open licenses, you'll hear me talk a lot about Creative Commons. These licenses essentially allow you to tell whoever the future user that might come across your work online, it allows you to tell them, these are the things that I will allow you to do with my work. You can share it, you can pass it on as long as you credit me, as long as you link back to my original publication, typically through the DOI or something. Or if I like, I can release it and say, hey, feel free to chop this up, cut pieces out, repurpose them into your course lectures or whatever you might want.
Right.
I don't have it on this screen, but typically on my presentations up in the upper right-hand corner here, you'll see a little copyright Creative Commons icon that basically is a permission for people to share that work. So I'll talk more about that when we get to that stage.
So if an instructor wanted to include this particular presentation in their offerings during their announcements, you're putting that icon there that allows them to do that, or they can share it? Is that
anybody can grab it, they can embed it in their course, they could add it to another library's information guide if they like. So it's this, what we call a remix or a permissive copyright, and that's a big part of SOAR, but not an absolute requirement. But I think it's important to kind of understand some of that. I can get into that in some detail in a little bit.
All right.
Let's just talk about what open access is and what SOAR is. So SOAR is, I already alluded to, an archive of student and faculty research at the University of St. Augustine. So we have all of our capstone projects, dissertations, and scholarly projects from students in there. We also collect, you may or may not be familiar if you're an online student, but some of the campuses each term have a sort of campus research day symposium where students present their capstone work or maybe give a discussion talk about one of their projects. Very often in terms of like a poster presentation at a conference. And we're collecting all those posters into SOAR. When faculty publish an article, in as much as their publishing agreement allows them to, we collect those papers, sometimes in the form of an author manuscript rather than the final publisher version. But those are all loaded into SOAR. These things are indexed in Google Scholar, and people, regardless of whether they have access to the journal subscription that these things might appear in, there is what we call an open access version available for people to consult for free. So when you're, if I don't know if you use Google Scholar much, but if you're in Google Scholar or one of the databases and you go searching for an article and you click and maybe the library doesn't have a subscription, so somehow you end up directed to the publisher site and they say they want you to pay $35 to be able to view that article. We could certainly get it for you through interlibrary loan, but very often the same document will have been made available in an open access version. It's just not the sort of polished, branded publisher version, but very often the same content. So we kind of run the gamut in terms of the versions that we archive in there. Obviously, your capstone projects and your dissertations are all the final version as approved. But when it comes to a published article, it might be a manuscript version of that article rather than the shiny branded publisher PDF. Like I said, these things are indexed in Google Scholar, so they're accessible by people around the world. At my last check, actually that's kind of cute because that says over 10,000 full text downloads. At my last check, we had been downloaded documents in SOAR had been downloaded over 40,000 times. So there's a little map on the SOAR webpage that shows kind of where we've been downloaded, and it's somewhere between 100 and 200 times a day now, and in countries all the way around the world. So when we say we're trying to make our research available to the world, that's stone cold documentation that we are doing that, and that research is being accessed. Interestingly, as a nursing student, you might like to know that some of the most downloaded and accessed work in the repository is work by some of our graduate students, and particularly some of our nursing students. So this is the website through my browser, and if you scroll down that page, you'll see the top 10 downloads as well as our most recent editions. You can see it's been downloaded 166 times in the last 24 hours. And then on the top 10 downloads, let's see, I think number 4, these are for the time that they've been up, their average downloads per day. Number 4 in our collection was a nursing student, I think, who just graduated in spring, if I recall right. So people are actually accessing and citing student work by being able to access it through the repository. If I'm going to talk about open access publication, when we contrast that to a traditional publication model, the main point is that this content is made freely available to the user, right? You're not required to have a subscription to a journal. You're not required to pay a viewing fee to access the article. If you've got a web connection and you can locate the article, you can get the full text of it. That's what we mean by open access. Now, obviously, given the commercial nature of publishing and the fact that publishers who put together a journal and manage peer review and design and all those things, and the web infrastructure that goes into delivering those materials, under a traditional model, they would make their profit at the end of that whole stage, right? So the authors would create the content. They would give that article to their publisher. The publisher would package it up, potentially printing it and distributing the journal itself through their subscription lists and things, right? But they would be selling that product at the market, and that's their profit. So essentially, they're selling their product to market, and that's how they're recouping all the costs that they've put into it. But we can think about that a little bit differently. Kind of look at all the work that's being done before the publisher ever gets a hold of it, gets a hold of an article. We've got the content being created by the authors. Peer review is typically done on a volunteer basis by scholars who maintain their service to their field. And more often than not, that research is somehow funded by someone who's not the publisher, right? It may be through federal funding or local institutional funding, but somebody else is paying for that research. So we've got all this labor and effort and financing all going into the creation of that work, but then the publisher packages it up and they're the only ones that profit from it. So that's fine. We're a capitalist society and that works well. But the problem is for librarians and for researchers and for students is that it becomes more and more expensive to access that material. So what open access does is essentially kind of looks at this model and says, well, we're spending all this money to pay for our expensive subscriptions to these expensive scholarly journals. We're doing a lot of the labor that goes into the creation of a journal, at least the institutions like universities, university staff and faculty are putting a lot of that effort in. So maybe we can take some of that money that we're spending on subscription fees and build up a publication infrastructure through our libraries, through our scholarly societies, and then we can manage and put together those publications in a way that makes it freely available to the viewer. So it reduces our subscription costs because we're now making those, we're supporting an infrastructure that provides that equitable access. But it also increases access to researchers and scholars around the world that may not have the institutional affiliations or the socioeconomic benefits to access these potentially very expensive resources. So that's kind of the economics and the philosophy behind what open access is. When it comes to journals, typically at this point, most journals will offer an open access option to their authors. So when you go to publish an article with a journal, you can typically publish it in the traditional format where then the author's going to charge a subscription fee or a pay per view for the article, or they may offer you an open access option. And in that situation, typically you would pay a small fee to make that available immediately for free to anyone who wants to view it. So by paying them at the point of publication, you're essentially providing them with the financial resources that they would normally get when they sold the final product to the market. So that article processing charge is a little weird because it becomes, it kind of falls into this pay to publish sort of framework, but you can see the economic sense because the publishers are no longer being able to sell that item, and it's essentially you're paying a fee to enable open access to your work. That allows them to not have to charge for the access and make that final published version open immediately. Now, other publishers, again, typically there are several options when you publish, but the publishers may have another option where instead of making the final published version available immediately and you pay this fee, we have what's called green open access. And in that case, the publisher would go through their traditional format. They would release that article, make it available through their subscriptions or for the pay-per-viewing fee, but they may allow the author to self-archive either that version or a manuscript or accepted manuscript version, and that's the kind of thing that we would put in SOAR. Whatever the publisher would allow, and sometimes that is the final publisher version, but very often it's an author manuscript of the version that was eventually published. So the last thing on that is part of that they want to kind of protect their ability to sell the access to that article. So they may have what we call an embargo, and that means that it may be 6 or 12 months before you're able to make that publicly available in an archive like SOAR. Any questions on that? Okay.
Yes. Eric, is that the same as saying that it's a dumbed down version?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So there are a couple of stages in the process, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but I would not say it's a dumbed down version. It might not be as shiny and pretty a version, but very often it's the same accepted content, just not in the polished, branded, colorful tables formatting of the publisher PDF, say. So you could take an accepted manuscript, maybe it's a Word document or a PDF of the text and maybe whatever tables or images might be provided, and put it side by side with the publisher version, assuming we're talking about the same version, and the content would be identical. It's also possible that the publisher might only allow an earlier revision and not the final accepted version to be archived. In that case, the content is probably quite similar, but there may have been some tweaks made through the peer review or through the editing process. But a lot of times the biggest difference is the branding, the polishing, the kind of fancy layout and all that. But those distinctions are being blurred more and more. So not a dumbed down version, certainly not a less informative version. There may be some difference in terms of late stage changes that were made depending on the version that the publisher allows to be archived. I often say, when people ask, well, who's doing this? Who's publishing articles in this way? Most of the journals that you're probably consulting on a daily basis have an open access option where you can pay to have that gold open access made available, or at least archive some version of the final publication. Like I said, most of the prestigious journals that you consult on a daily basis probably have that option. PubMed Central is when you access full text and it's like freely available in PubMed through PubMed Central. That's an open access archive of the materials that have been indexed in PubMed, or at least some of those materials, right? There are journals that are fully open, meaning that from publication, those articles are made available for free download, for the ability to share those articles without issues of copyright. I'm currently in the process of working with some students here at the university to publish an OT journal within SOAR, and that is 100% open access. On the PubMed Central thing, one of the reasons that these things are becoming more common is that a lot of federal funding, a lot of state government funding in the US, in the UK, in Europe, have started to mandate that if you receive federal funding to pay for your research, you have to make that published research available to the public in the form of an open access venue. So they don't want taxpayers to be funding research, but then the taxpayers don't have access to the publications that result from that research. So there's been, over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of laws enacted in various at various levels of government and in various countries that require that information be made available. So sometimes faculty will archive work on their own personal web page or through their social media or something like that, or they could archive it with an institutional repository like SOAR. And that brings us to SOAR and depositing your work in our local open access repository, or you might just call it an archive. I do want to point out that typically there is some variation between different academic disciplines, but scholars who publish their work in open access venues or who archive their work in an open access repository or archive like SOAR have been demonstrated to show a significant citation advantage, meaning their work is more likely to be cited if it's in an open access venue than if it's behind a publisher paywall. And that makes perfect sense, right? Of course, you're gonna, if you're able to view the article and don't have to pay for it, you're gonna be more likely to cite it. If you can't access an article because it's behind a paywall, or you don't have the institutional subscriptions and things that the library might offer, you're gonna be less likely to cite that source because you can't get to it. So making work available in an open access venue, whether it's publishing in an open access journal or depositing a version of the article in a repository like SOAR, you will most likely be cited more often than if you did not. There is some variation just in general citation practices between different disciplines. I think like physics and biology articles there's a massive impact of open access in that regard, whereas because humanities and arts and things tend to cite fewer articles per publication, their reference lists are generally a little bit shorter, so those citation advantages change a little bit between disciplines. There have been a couple that were shown kind of inconclusive. They didn't necessarily show that advantage, or a few that showed no citation advantage, but the vast majority of studies that have looked at that do show some significant advantage to publishing in open access venues. I talked about the phases of publication, and this is important for the archive, maybe a little less so for students at this point who are putting together their capstones or dissertations. But as a manuscript goes through the peer review and publication process, there's a couple of phases. And these are important because the publishing agreement that you actually finally publish under may only allow certain versions of that manuscript to be archived. That is heavily dependent on the publisher. It's also heavily dependent on how strongly you push to be able to make things available in an open access venue. So it is possible to make changes to a publishing agreement. They're not set in stone or ironclad. If you go to the publisher and say, hey, my institution wants me to be able to archive this in our repository, then you may be able to get them to give some ground. Typically, what I would say the most common for a published article is for the publisher to allow the accepted manuscript to be archived. If we think about the phases, there's the original draft when you first submit to the publisher, and we might call that the raw manuscript, right? Before the publisher has put any input into it whatsoever. There's no peer review. There's been no copy editing, maybe, but beyond what you've done yourself, and you submit that to them for their consideration to publish. Now, you may go through a couple of stages of revision, either copy editing or peer review, and those are typically referred to as preprints. Most publishers don't have a problem with you archiving any version of a preprint, and preprints have gotten a big name in the news lately because of a lot of the work that is being consulted on COVID is in the form of preprints, because that advanced so rapidly that a lot of the research that was being done on it didn't have time to go through the whole peer review process, which affected kind of how some of those things hit the news, right? Because there are all these things being claimed to be effective, but they've not gone through controlled clinical trials or peer-reviewed studies or things like that. That research only existed as a preprint. Once you've gone through the peer review process, you've gone through the acceptance by the publisher, then we talk about the accepted manuscript. And that's essentially where the content is identical to the final publisher version. They've said, hey, this is the one, we'll take this. There might be minor differences in copy editing, like just some last minute corrections and things. But the major differences between the accepted manuscript and the publisher version are really cosmetic. They may do some column formatting, they may do some margin justifications, maybe some color tables and kind of fancier bells and whistles to make it look prettier. But once that manuscript is accepted, the content is identical to the final publisher version. So depending on what your publishing agreement says, you may be able to archive one or all of those different versions. And of course, the later versions, the publisher version is the ideal, right? Where we're publishing exactly what gets published in the journal. We're archiving the exact same thing. But the accepted manuscript is certainly a viable option. I just want to point out Sherpa Romeo. This is an online tool that when you're considering publishing, lets you look at a particular journal and identify what that journal standard publishing agreement looks like and what they'll allow you to archive in terms of, say you want to have a website with your work, or you want to have a profile within the institutional repository that has all your work listed. Sherpa Romeo is a way for you to look at that, to look at the agreements of that publisher, and decide essentially, are they open access enough that I want to publish with them? What can I archive if I do publish my article through that journal? So I just wanted to show you that real quick. The website was on that page, but you can just Google search Sherpa Romeo too if you like. Let's find a journal of pain management. So here's the entry for that journal of pain management. And now if we scroll down to the publisher policy, we'll see the submitted version, which would be the raw manuscript, right? The early draft. There's no restrictions on that. You can deposit that in the institutional repository, no problem. If you want to, you can get a little more detail here. So embargo, that's the 6 or 12 month delay that we talked about, and where you can archive that as the institutional repository. The accepted version looks like they'll also allow you to archive the manuscript accepted version with no embargo, meaning as soon as that article is published, you can deposit the accepted manuscript in your institutional repository and make that available. No charge, no embargo, as long as you get that publisher permission. And then they say that they do not allow for the final published version to go into the archive. So in that instance, you would have to get their permission, but you would be able to access or to archive the accepted manuscript version. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's kind of the background to all this. When it comes to our discussion of student projects or student things, you haven't signed over the copyright to those typically, so that really doesn't come into play. And very few publishers consider an archived dissertation or a capstone or something like that to be prior publication, in the sense that that would exclude you from being able to publish it elsewhere. But if we stop and think about it, what do we mean by publication, right? There are stages of publication, as we saw with the different manuscripts, but really publication is the idea of making that research public. If it's a dissertation or something, your sort of equivalent of peer review is your faculty approval, right? And now you're, let's say, publishing it in the repository, so it's able to be accessible. So in the sense that you go on to publish that work, that meaning has kind of shifted in the current scholarly communication environment, right? What it used to mean was that you had a single copy of your dissertation on the library shelf, but maybe you went on to revamp that and have it published in a journal article that then got wider dissemination. I hope you'll see that from the map that I showed you of the SOAR downloads that you're probably not going to get any wider dissemination by publishing in a journal than you would by publishing in SOAR. But if you're publishing an article elsewhere and there are copyright questions, then the versions that you can make available through SOAR are the ones that we discussed. Quick note on author rights. I do want to make people aware that when it comes to copyright, you already have the rights to your work. Depositing, if you want to deposit before you sign a publishing agreement that signs away your copyright to a publisher, you can certainly do that. There's nothing that says you have to publish in a journal. Certainly the peer review and all of that is important for vetting research and that sort of thing. But if you do go that route and you do want to publish your work in a peer-reviewed journal, and there are definitely reasons to pursue that, keep in mind that you only lose the rights that you give up, that you voluntarily sign away, right? So when it comes to your publishing agreements, consider what you would like to do with your work and make sure that that's in your publishing agreement. If you want to be able to archive your work in an open access venue and benefit from that citation advantage that we discussed, you can write that into your publishing agreement and say, I know you say that you own the copyright, but it's important to me that I reserve the right to archive at least an accepted manuscript version in my institutional repository. So when you do sign those publishing agreements, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can carve out particular things that you would like to retain. Maybe you want to be able to use any images or tables in a course in the future. And if you were to sign away those rights, then you would have to get the publisher permission to put that table from your article into your course lecture or something like that. That's an extreme version, but that's certainly a possibility. So I encourage you to take a look at this. SPARC is the Scholarly Publishers and Research Coalition. That they put out this author rights brochure that kind of talks about copyright and retaining your author rights, particularly in order to be able to reuse your own work and to share your work in open access venues. Incredibly valuable little read, and not terribly dense and not terribly legalistic either. One thing they do talk about in there is the ability to just attach a writer. I don't know if I have a slide in here for that. I don't think I do. You can just attach a simple addendum, a single page addendum to whatever publishing agreement that you're signing, bring that to the publisher's attention and say, notwithstanding anything that's been said in the contract above, I reserve the right to archive in my institutional repository and to reuse any of this material in future educational work. So they give you suggestions for very simple ways to amend your publishing agreement so that you can take part in open access archiving and institutional repositories and things like that. So do take a look at that and consider reserving certain rights for yourselves and adding that to your publishing agreement where necessary. I'm certainly available to students and faculty both who are considering doing something like that. I'd be happy to work with you to make that happen in the way that you want it to happen. And most publishers, depending on how you present that information to them, are somewhat open to making certain accommodations. If your research is solid and they want to publish it, then they're probably not going to let the fact that you want to be able to archive it in your institutional repository stand in the way. So they will give some ground, particularly if it's presented well. And I have some good suggestions for that. So when you are publishing, think about the possibility of investigating the publisher's copyright policies, what their open access policies allow. I noticed that this Sherpa Romeo, which is the tool that I showed you for investigating publisher policies, they've actually changed their format, so this slide looks a little out of date if it looks unfamiliar compared to what we explored. But keep that in mind. Consider adding those addendums, retaining your rights, and that sort of thing. And feel free to reach out to me for any assistance. So that's a lot of background. That's the big lead up as we go into our tour here. So though with all that, I want to open up for any questions, and then I'm going to jump in and give you a kind of a detailed tour of SOAR. Any questions about any of the stuff that I covered there?
Well, that's fine. Can you just tell us where to find it on the library page?
Yeah. I'll actually demonstrate that right now. So from the library homepage, once I get this up, we have events over here, and there's an archive. So if you click on the archived events, you'll see several tabs, and this would probably go under scholarly communications. So you'll when this thing does load, you'll see all the kind of previous recorded lectures that I've given in the past and that other librarians have given on various topics. So that's where you'll be able to access this once it's posted. I usually have it posted. Sometimes it takes some editing, and I have a feeling this one's going to take a little more editing than usual. So I usually have it posted within 2 or 3 days. So just to get you the full tour of SOAR, if you just Google SOAR USA, hopefully it's the first thing that comes up. There was this Save Our Aging Religious organization that was taking my slot for a while. I was getting a little irritated. So this is the archive. You can see we've got it divided up into various collections of student research, faculty research. This one is the journal that we've been working on for the last year and have just started to publish. So you can see the various collections. Just to show it off, this is the Student Journal of Occupational Therapy. We launched this about almost a year ago. It was right around the first of the year that we first put our call out, and we were just starting to publish the papers that we sent through our entire peer review process and everything. I'm pretty excited about that. If we look into the student research collections, I think I already kind of pointed out this kind of map that shows where the work is being downloaded. See, just from the student research collections, capstones, dissertations, and scholarly projects, we've had 100 downloads just in the last 24 hours. So that work is being accessed, and the more it's accessed, the more likely it is that you'll actually be cited, which I think is important to some folks if they plan to pursue a position as a faculty member or something like that. When you're in and looking at a particular article, I want to take you into this faculty and staff research. I did mention that sometimes these will be author manuscripts, but very often they'll be the actual final publisher version. So I just want to look at a couple here. This is the athletic training part. So these are typically some of our physical therapists that work with athletes. You'll see an individual record here. It tracks downloads for the single article. So this one article has been downloaded almost 200 times. If you like, you can come in and follow individual scholars to see if more work gets posted in SOAR. You can follow them, and then you'll receive an email announcement that says, "Hey, Jordan Utley published a new article." So that's kind of useful. As a scholar, if once your work has been deposited in here, you can log into your SOAR USA account and view whatever publications you might have within SOAR. And when you do that, you're able to view a personal dashboard. So for the works that you've uploaded, you'll get a chance to look at this dashboard and see where your work's being downloaded, what institutions are accessing it, so much. But you can view this specifically for your work and see where it's being downloaded, track numbers, and see if you're creating some faculty scholarly research impact. You can see how often your work is being accessed and write that into your faculty or tenure promotion package. And then the last thing is this PlumX. So PlumX is what we call an alt metrics. These are alternative metrics. Rather than simple citation counts, this looks at a number of other things, including social media mentions, blog mentions, if a paper is picked up by a news reporting source, as well as just accessing abstracts and viewing the records for items. So you can see the official downloads, but we've also got a large number of people who went in and viewed abstracts. Not seeing anything in here on the news or the blog counts, but those are viewable for you for your own personal research. So that's kind of the personal reporting information. The next thing, the only other thing I want to show you before I show you submission stuff is the symposia and research days. So these are the campus collections for the research days that have taken place on campus. Since COVID, the OT program has been doing these virtual capstone symposia online. So you can see that we're collecting poster presentations in here too. So if faculty have presented at a conference, we can collect those as well. I just like this one because rather than just having the simple PDF display, it actually displays the posters from these individuals, and then of course you can go in and view the full size poster itself or download that if you like. Many of these are actually linked to student capstone projects because they might be a presentation of a capstone project. So then those two records would be linked, and they'd be able to link directly to the dissertation the poster was based on too. So when it comes time, you'll if you're a student at this point, you will be depositing your capstone or scholarly project or dissertation in SOAR. And when that happens, when the time comes for that, it will need to be approved. You can't submit it before it's been approved. So you should have your faculty signature pages with their digital signatures in there before you submit. But if you have other work that you'd like to submit, or you want to reach out to me to see if we could include something, you're certainly welcome. And to submit through SOAR, just from the homepage, you would come in here and then click Submit Research. And then once you've done that, you'll select the collection that you would be submitting to, and then fill out. It's just a very simple form. So let's do physical therapy. It's just a very simple form where you input all the information, your abstract, your publication date, and all that, and then I'll do just a quick screening before it posts online. If you are depositing a manuscript or a publisher version of something that's been published and has been indexed in PubMed, you can just index or you can just add the PubMed ID number here for your article, and then you can instantly import all of that information on the article from PubMed. So I just put in that ID number and click import, and now I've got the title, I've got my authors, document type, publication date, publication title. So all that information gets pulled in, including the abstract from PubMed. So that's a nice simplified way to add a lot of that information. But that's SOAR. Like I said, we're pretty proud of it. We've been working hard to develop the content in there, and I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to add their work to SOAR. We do have a sort of a drawing set up for faculty right now because it's open access week. Any faculty who deposit their work in SOAR and have a fully, have the full text available, and do go through that deposit process using the Submit Research link, they'll be entered in a drawing, and we've got a couple of Amazon gift cards that we'll be giving away at the end of the month. So you have from now to October 31st or probably actually November 1st to get that work in there to qualify for the drawing. But other than that, I just want to say thanks for coming out. I noticed a few people dwindled in and dwindled back out. But if anybody has any questions at all, I can answer them now, or I can just refer you to my contact information. Yeah, there we go. There's my contact information.